Welcome back. Today, we are jumping straight into a fascinating explainer on something that completely baffles a lot of people. How did the Vikings actually survive the absolute freezer that is the North Atlantic? I mean, we're talking about crossing icy oceans centuries before Gore-Tex and modern survival gear were even a thought. It's an incredible story of human resilience, so let's get into it. Picture this for a second. You are sitting just a couple of feet above pitch black, near freezing water. Freezing spray is whipping over the edge of the boat. Your clothes are soaked, and a bitter wind has been cutting right through you for hours on end. And here's the kicker. There is no below deck. You can't just go inside. A Viking longship had no cabins, no cozy stoves, and honestly, zero mercy. So we really have to ask, how on earth did they stay warm out there? Well, to figure that out, we have to shatter the Hollywood illusion right off the bat. You know the trope? The stoic, shirtless warrior, draped in a giant bearskin, standing at the prow of a ship looking totally unfazed by an Arctic blizzard. Pop culture makes it seem like they just had this magical, immune to the cold northern blood. But the historical reality? It was vastly different. They were often miserably, bone-chillingly cold. They faced very real, severe risks of hypothermia, and their bodies lost heat following the exact same biological rules ours do. They didn't have a magical immunity. What they did have was an incredibly brilliant, well-organized system for dealing with those rules.
That brings us to part one of their system, timing the sailing season.
Look, the absolute best way to survive a freezing storm at sea is to just not be there. Vikings didn't seek out winter sailing for the drama. Winter meant shorter days, incredibly violent storms, sea ice, and temperatures that turned a splash of water into a lethal threat. So long-distance voyages were strictly confined to the summer months, and even then, routes to places like Greenland had notoriously narrow safety windows. Basically, medieval sources make it very clear, the easiest way to survive a North Atlantic gale is to be standing inside a sturdy house. Knowing when not to sail was practically step one of survival. Moving right along to part two, wool, which was their real armor. Because even in summer, the North Atlantic is going to throw freezing rain and fog right at your face. And since the open ship offered zero shelter, their defense had to be worn on their backs. The secret weapon here wasn't iron, it was wool. A sailor's layered system would typically start with a linen undergarment if they could get it, then build up with woolen tunics and leg coverings, and finally top it all off with a super dense, tightly woven wool cloak. Now, wool is kind of amazing. Its fibers are naturally crimped, which means they trap thousands of tiny pockets of air right against your skin. That trapped air acts as a barrier, slowing down heat loss. Plus, layering meant they could constantly adjust, add a piece, loosen a tie, take something off, as the weather or their workload shifted. And this layered wool system provided what we can call the margin of life. Now let's be real, wool isn't magic. It's not going to keep you perfectly toasty when you're completely soaked. Wet wool is heavy, and a stiff wind will strip your heat away pretty fast. But compared to plant-based fabrics, which instantly collapse flat against your skin and sap your body heat the second they get wet, damp wool actually retains a little bit of useful insulation. Out on the open ocean, that tiny margin of retained heat is literally the difference between shaking off a rogue wave and spiraling into fatal hypothermia. There's a saying among historians that I absolutely love: no wool, no voyage. Every single tunic, blanket, cloak, mitten, and massive woolen sail took staggering amounts of fiber to clean, spin, and weave. This entire survival system was completely dependent on the quiet, massive labor of communities of women back home. You know, the swords and axes get all the flashy museum posters, but honestly, it was the spindle that kept people alive and actually moved civilization across the oceans. Let's look at part three: human heat, fuel, and hard work.
So, without a furnace on the ship, where did the heat actually come from? Well, the crew themselves. Just huddling 30 people together inside a cramped, narrow hull generates its own little warmer microclimate. But they were also pumping out massive amounts of heat through sheer physical labor, rowing, hauling heavy lines, steering. But here's the catch: working that hard means you sweat. And in the cold, sweat is a killer. Your body burns through precious heat just trying to evaporate it. If you sweat through all those wool layers while rowing, and then sit absolutely still for your rest shift, the wind hits that damp fabric and boom, yesterday's heroic exertion turns into tonight's medical emergency. So they had to be incredibly disciplined about taking layers off before they overheated.
Now you might be wondering, if they were out there freezing, why didn't they just build a fire on board? Well, think about the environment for a second. You were sitting on a wooden ship, completely surrounded by highly combustible ropes covered in tar, right next to a giant wool or canvas sail. Space is practically non-existent.
The moment a rogue wave hits, hot coals go flying everywhere, the smoke blinds the crew, basically one poorly timed gust of wind, and you've accidentally turned your ship into a floating funeral pyre. So no way. The absolute safest place for a stove was always a beach.
Instead of external fire, they had to fuel their internal metabolic furnaces. Producing constant body heat takes a ton of energy, especially when you're working hard. So to survive, they packed highly dense, non-perishable calories. We're talking butter, cheese, dried fish, heavily salted meats. Fat was basically gold because it's so incredibly energy dense. And hey, while we know they definitely brought ale on these trips, alcohol is actually a terrible idea for staying warm. It dilates your blood vessels and makes you lose body heat way faster. So they weren't relying on liquid courage out there. They were literally burning dense fats and proteins just to keep their internal engines running.
Which brings us to part 4, the ultimate shelter, which is, of course, land. Because when the sea finally eroded whatever tiny bit of comfort you had left, you had to get off the water. Trying to pitch a tent on a moving ship in a storm is a hilariously bad idea. It blocks your view, it gets tangled in the rigging, and like the old sailing joke goes, a tent in a gale won't protect you, it's just going to catch the wind and relocate itself to Scotland. So shelter was purely opportunistic. If they were anchored in a calm bay, they might rig a covering over the deck. But the real goal was to drag that ship onto a beach, pitch a proper tent on solid ground, build a roaring, safe fire, and finally dry their clothes out. This reality actually drove their entire navigational strategy across the North Atlantic, something historians call the chain of landfalls. The Viking expansion wasn't just one blind, crazy leap across the ocean. It was a calculated series of island hops, from Norway to the Shetlands, up to the Faroes, over to Iceland, and then on to Greenland. Hitting land wasn't a delay or a sign of failure, it was the whole point. Getting ashore meant you could cook a hot meal, refill your fresh water, fix broken gear, and maybe, just maybe, sleep without the floor constantly trying to roll you into the sea.
And that takes us to part 5, a system of collective survival. This is the real core of our explainer today. Surviving the Viking Age was never about one guy's individual macho toughness. It was a completely systemic, collective effort. The entire crew was meticulously divided into watches. So while one group rode their hearts out, generating heat and moving the ship forward, another group was resting, hoarding their energy under dry blankets. This balance was absolutely crucial. It prevented the whole crew from burning out or freezing to death all at the exact same time.
Every single person's life depended on the competence of the person sitting next to them. While one guy steered, someone else was constantly bailing freezing water out of the bottom of the boat. A sailor who ignored their layers and let themselves get violently numb from the cold wasn't being stoic. They were becoming a massive liability. I mean, if your fingers are too frozen to grab a vital rope when a squall hits, the entire ship flips. But above all of that physical labor, survival relied on leadership. Someone had to have the hard-earned wisdom to read the ocean currents, look at a darkening sky, recognize a dangerous stretch of coastline, and have the guts to say, "Nope, we are turning back." An experienced captain's cultural knowledge of the weather was their ultimate defense mechanism. Because let's face it, no amount of tightly woven wool is going to save you from completely reckless navigation.
So here is the big takeaway. We really need to strip away that myth of the lone, fearless explorer standing tall at the prow of the ship, laughing at the storm. That's just not how it worked. True survival looked like 30 incredibly exhausted, cold people crammed into a wet, open wooden hull. It looked like relentlessly managing layers of wool, working in strict shifts, and quite literally keeping one another alive through pure, unyielding discipline.
The Vikings never defeated the northern climate. Nobody really does. Instead, they negotiated with it. They prepared for the absolute worst using ordinary, everyday materials, but applied them with extraordinary collective discipline. So I'll leave you with a thought. When you look at the staggering amount of preparation, the endless community labor, and the sheer mental and physical endurance required just to cross the sea, if you were stripped of all your modern gear and dropped into that open hull, do you think you'd have the discipline to survive the voyage? Think about that the next time you feel a little winter chill. Thanks so much for tuning into this explainer, and we will catch you in the next one.